The old man had been tending that garden for 40 years. Everyone on Sycamore Street knew him. Everyone knew the garden. In a neighborhood where lawns were mowed on schedule and flower beds were maintained with the particular competitive energy of people who care about such things, Henry Aldrich's garden was something else entirely. It was extraordinary. Roses that bloomed in colors that seemed to belong to a different climate. Hedges shaped with a precision that suggested professional training. A vegetable garden in the back that produced year after year a yield that Henry distributed to his neighbors with the quiet generosity of someone who has more than enough and finds meaning in the giving. He had moved into the house at 19 Sycamore Street in 1983. He had been 41 years old. He had arrived alone with a moving truck and very little conversation, and he had remained alone for 40 years, tending his garden and keeping his own company and being, by every account from every neighbor who had known him across 4 decades, a kind and private man. He died on a Wednesday in September. He was 81 years old. He was found by his neighbor, a woman named Diane, who had noticed that his front curtains hadn't been opened for 3 days and had used the spare key he had given her for emergencies. She found him in his armchair. Peaceful, the paramedics said. He had simply stopped. He had no family. No next of kin that anyone on Sycamore Street knew of. His estate went to probate, and when the estate attorney went through the house to prepare an inventory, she found something in the basement that she was not prepared for, something that made her call the police before she had finished the first room. The estate attorney's name was Patricia Cole. She had practiced probate law for 22 years. She had inventoried hundreds of estates. She had seen over those years the full range of what people accumulated over a lifetime and left behind without adequate instructions. She had never seen anything like Henry Aldrich's basement. The basement was organized with the same precision as the garden above it. Shelves along every wall, labeled, categorized, maintained with care, filing cabinets, storage boxes, the archive of a meticulous mind. But it was not the organization that made Patricia call the police. It was what was organized. Photographs, thousands of them, filed by date, by location, by subject. People, mostly women, captured at distance in public spaces, going about their ordinary lives. Grocery stores, parks, parking lots, street corners, coffee shops. None of them appeared to know they were being photographed. And beside the photographs, cross-referenced by the same filing system, detailed journals. 40 years of journals, written in a small, careful hand, documenting, observing, recording. Patricia stood in the basement of Henry Aldrich's house on a Wednesday afternoon and understood that she had been neighbors with something she had not understood at all. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Karen Holloway, 44 years old, 16 years with the department. She had worked missing persons, assault, and homicide. She had never walked into a dead man's basement and found 40 years of surveillance. She went through it methodically. The photographs were the beginning. There were thousands of them. Developed film, printed and filed, spanning 4 decades. The earliest were from the mid-1980s. The most recent were from 3 months before Henry's death. He had not stopped. He had kept going well into his 80s with the dedication of someone for whom this was not a hobby but a practice. Karen identified 17 women who appeared repeatedly across the files, not as passing subjects, but as sustained subjects, tracked over months or years, documented across multiple locations. She began the work of identifying them. The first woman Karen identified was a 67-year-old retired teacher named Susan, who still lived in the city. She had appeared in Henry's files beginning in 1987 and continuing, with gaps, until 2019. 32 years. Karen drove to her house on a Thursday morning. She sat across from Susan in her living room and explained, as carefully as she knew how, what she had found. Susan was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "I always felt like someone was watching me." She said it simply, without drama, the way people say things that they have been carrying for a long time and have never had occasion to say out loud. She said, "Not always, not constantly, but sometimes in public I would have a feeling. The particular feeling of being observed when you can't identify the source. I learned to live with it. I told myself I was being paranoid." She said, "I wasn't paranoid." Karen asked, "Do you know who Henry Aldrich was?" Susan thought about it. She said, "There was a man, years ago, on the east side. There was a man I would sometimes see near the school, in the parking lot, on the street nearby. I never spoke to him. I mentioned him to a colleague once, and she said I was imagining it. She said, I wasn't imagining it." The second woman Karen identified had moved away from the city in 1994. She was now 71 years old and lived in Florida. Karen reached her by phone. She said almost the same thing as Susan. She said, "I used to feel watched. I moved partly because of it. I thought a change of location would make it stop." Karen asked, "Did it?" The woman was quiet. Then she said, "I never felt it again after I moved. I always thought that was strange. I thought a feeling should have come with me, if it was in my head." She said, "It wasn't in my head." Karen spent 3 weeks working through the 17 women. She reached 12 of them. 2 had died, 3 could not be located. Of the 12 she spoke to, 10 described the same experience, a feeling of being observed, a vague unease in public spaces. Several had changed routines, moved neighborhoods, altered their lives in small or significant ways in response to a feeling they had never been able to name. None of them had ever reported it. None of them had ever had anything concrete enough to report. A feeling is not evidence. Henry Aldrich had known this. He had operated in the space between the feeling and the evidence for 40 years. Karen went back through the journals. She was looking for something specific now. She had the photographs. She had the documentation. She had the evidence of sustained, deliberate surveillance spanning 4 decades. What she was looking for was why. The journals were detailed. Henry wrote about the women he observed with a clinical precision that she found deeply unsettling. He noted their routines, their habits, their relationships. He noted changes over time. A new job, a move, a marriage, a child. He wrote about them as if he knew them. He wrote about them as if they belonged, in some way, to his world. But he did not appear to have ever made contact with any of them. He had observed. He had documented. He had maintained a distance that was, in its own way, as deliberate as everything else he did. And then, on page 847 of the 14th journal, Karen found something that reframed everything. It was a passage dated 1991. Henry was 49 years old. He had been engaged in what he called his practice for approximately 6 years. He wrote, "I understand that what I do is not permitted. I have never touched any of them. I have never spoken to any of them. I have only watched. I know that this distinction does not make it right. I have spent years trying to understand why I do this, and I have arrived at an answer that does not satisfy me, but that I believe is true. I am afraid of people. I have always been afraid of people. I can only be near them from a distance. I can only feel connected to the world through glass, through a lens, through the remove of documentation. I know this is a failure. I know it causes harm I cannot see. I do not know how to stop." Karen read this passage several times. She thought about it for a long time. Then she kept reading. On page 1203 of the 19th journal, dated 2009, Henry wrote something that made Karen sit very still for several minutes. He wrote, "I found her today, after 22 years. I did not approach her. I would not approach her. But I found her. She is well. She has children. She has a life that is good and full. She does not know that I look for her sometimes. She does not know that finding her, knowing she is safe and whole and living well, is the closest thing to peace I have found in 22 years of looking." Karen went back to the files. She looked for a woman who appeared in the files beginning around 1987 and then disappearing and then reappearing in 2009. She found her. The woman's name, Karen determined after several days of work, was Margaret. She had disappeared from Henry's files in 1987. She had reappeared briefly in 2009 and then not again. Karen found Margaret through the records. She was 69 years old. She lived in a town 90 miles away. Karen drove to see her on a Monday morning. Margaret opened the door and looked at Karen for a moment. Karen introduced herself. She explained she was investigating the estate of a man named Henry Aldrich. Something moved across Margaret's face. Very briefly. Karen asked if she could come in. Margaret made tea. She sat across from Karen at a kitchen table that was covered in the evidence of a full life. Mail, a child's drawing, a half-finished crossword. Karen told her what she had found in Henry's basement. The photographs, the journals, the 40 years of documentation. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Karen finished, she said, "What do you want to know?" Karen said, "The journals mention you, but I believe it's you. He wrote about you differently from the others. He wrote about looking for you for 22 years. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Henry Aldrich was my father." The silence in the kitchen lasted a very long time. Karen said, "Your father," Margaret said, "my biological father. My mother left him when I was 4 years old. She didn't tell him where we went. She had reasons, good reasons. He was not a stable man when she knew him. When I was young," she said, "I found out who he was when I was in my 30s, through records. I chose not to make contact. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know who he had become." She said, "I didn't know he was looking for me." Karen asked, "Did you know he was watching you before 2009? Margaret said, "No, not until you told me just now." She looked at her hands. She said, "He was watching me before I knew he existed, from 1987. That was the year I moved to the city. He must have found me somehow, found out where I was." She said, "He watched me for 2 years and then I moved again, and he lost me. And then in 2009, he found me again. She said, he never approached me. He never said a word. She said, he just watched. Karen asked what Margaret wanted to do with this information. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, he's dead. He can't be charged with anything, and even if he could, he never touched anyone. He watched, he documented, he maintained a distance for 40 years. She said, I don't know what I feel about it. I don't know what I feel about him. He was a troubled man who was apparently afraid of people his entire life and chose the worst possible way to manage that fear. And he was also a man who spent 22 years looking for a daughter he had never known, who wrote about finding her safe and calling that peace. She said, I don't know how to hold both of those things at the same time. She said, maybe that's just what grief is. The women on Henry Aldrich's list were contacted. They were told what had been found. They were given the opportunity to review their files or not, as they chose. Most chose not to. 2 chose to review them. Susan, the retired teacher, sat in a room with Karen and went through 20 years of photographs of herself going about her ordinary life. She was quiet throughout. When she finished, she said, he never got close to me. In all these years, he never got close to me. And I spent years afraid of a feeling I couldn't name. She said, I want to feel angry. I do feel angry, but I also feel something else I don't have a word for. Karen asked what it was. Susan thought about it. She said, sad, for him, which I didn't expect. The house at 19. Sycamore Street was sold as part of the estate. The garden was maintained by the new owners for 1 season, and then gradually allowed to become something more ordinary. The roses were pruned back, the hedges lost their precise shapes. Diane, who had lived next door for 20 years and had used the spare key on that Wednesday in September, tended a small part of the border garden herself, at the edge of the 2 properties, because she found she could not let it go entirely. She had liked Henry. She had genuinely liked him. She had found him kind and private and interesting, in the way that people who have clearly lived inside their own minds are interesting. She had not known. She thinks about that sometimes. The distance between what we see and what is there, the gap between the face someone presents and the life they have built behind it. She tends the border garden. She does not fully understand what she feels when she does, but she does it anyway. Because the garden is still beautiful, and beauty, she has decided, does not require the maker to be without fault. It only requires someone willing to tend it. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes only.